Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're discussing helping children cope with racial stress and manage emotions with Dr. Erlanger Earl Turner, author of Raising Resilient Black Kids. Earl is a licensed psychologist and associate professor of psychology at Pepperdine University in Los Angeles, California. As a nationally and internationally recognized expert in mental health, he has been featured on television, radio, and in print media outlets including CNN, USA Today, The New York Times, Essence, NPR, Los Angeles Times, and The Dr. Phil Show. He is former president of the Society for Children and Family Policy and Practice and has served as a consultant for Sesame Street, Instagram, and other organizations on racial justice initiatives. Turner is also founder of Therapy for Black Kids, whose mission is to help promote resilience and healthy emotional development among Black youth. You can find out more about Turner at www.erlangerturner.com. Hi, Dr. Earl. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'd like to start out by asking you to define racial stress and particularly how it shows up for children.
Yeah, I think that's, a really important question because often we think about any type of diagnoses, symptoms, we want to run to the DSM, especially as professionals. And I think sometimes as parents too, that they are concerned about what types of labels their child has. So I do like to emphasize that when we talk about racial stress, that it is not a mental health diagnosis, that it really is just a way to understand some of the experiences of your child. And so the current way that we think about racial stress is that it includes a lot of different types of psychological symptoms that may be emotional, they may be behavioral in different ways, they also may be cognitive or social. And so it can show up in a lot of different ways for children. And I think one of the probably important ways that it shows up is some from the emotional side. So when children experience or witness aspects of discrimination, they may show signs of sadness. They may show worry or anxiety about, their own safety or how they may be treated by others. And sometimes they may have worries about their parents, especially in the context of the ways that we see all of these incidents of police violence, for example, in the Black community, that children sometimes are worried about their parents when they're away from them. So it may show up in that way as well. And then I think some of the ways that are also important to consider are the cognitive and social areas. So for children, how they think about themselves, what types of negative messages do they receive from society about their identity or being less than others in terms of their self-esteem. Those are also some really important factors that may show up in children. And then some of the social aspects. So I think, especially when you have a child who is maybe going to a school that is maybe not as diverse or maybe doesn't look as much like them, maybe they're the only child, Black child in that school, that could impact how they socially interact, especially when they've experienced some type of racial discrimination. So those are just a couple of ways that it can show up in children.
Well, and I like what you're talking about, how you're sort of taking it out of the DSM and talking about how it impacts your everyday life. And I like your focus, especially in this book, about building resilience versus focusing on, like you said, a diagnosis or something being wrong, but as a sort of building on that. And you lay out a method that you call HEAL. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, so I created the HEAL method, which stands for Healing Emotions and Anxiety Through Liberation. And this particular approach really combines a number of different psychological principles that we often integrate either clinically or sometimes from a research perspective. And so, looking at factors of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, integrating aspects of racial socialization and how do we talk with children about their own identity and experiences of racial discrimination, but also building on liberation psychology and how do we help foster this sense of sort of independence about their own experiences in the world, but also instilling some hope and allowing children to think about ways that they can engage in action to promote a better society and community for themselves. So the Heal method really builds upon those particular principles. And I really wanted to focus the workbook on sort of navigating through multiple aspects of all of those things. And so in the book, it includes some journal prompts for parents to help kids and themselves to process some of these experiences based upon those approaches, and also activities and exercises that help kids sort of cope with racial discrimination through building on those practices within those particular principles.
Yeah, and a big chunk of the workbook is actually for the parent or caregiver to take time to reflect on their own experiences with racism and discrimination. And you really talk about filling your glass before you can fill others. Can you talk about why that's so important?
For me, as a child psychologist in particular, that oftentimes when I'm working with children, the parents, and I think, I'm not a parent, but I work with parents a lot, and I have a parent. And so I think that oftentimes parents sometimes give of themselves fully to the well-being of their child, and sometimes doesn't, take as much time for themselves in terms of like self-care or even their own physical well-being. And so really, for me to remind parents and encourage them to really remember that in order for you to take care of your child, you also have to take care of yourself. And so really leaning into that and making sure that you are in a good space physically and emotionally is also a really important process of supporting your child and helping them to build resilience in the face of all of these encounters, particularly as it relates to racial discrimination.
Yeah, and as parents are sort of working through their own experiences, you talk about communication as a key piece of promoting resilience for your child. Can you say more about why that's important in that development of resilience?
Yeah, so I think one is that sometimes it can be really difficult to like have this like ongoing communication with your child outside of instances where something is sort of maybe not going well for them, or they're misbehaving, or if you're wanting to remind them or prepare them for something. So, let's say for older children who may be approaching sort of this early adolescence phase, that sometimes parents work late. And so the child is, they get home from school off the bus and they have to sort of be at home, for an hour or two by themselves. And so parents may talk with them about like the do's and don'ts of like, once you get home from school, what you should do, and that's really important. But I also think that it is helpful to like foster this ongoing communication and relationship with your child to talk about all types of things and just sort of checking in about like, hey, how was school today? Because sometimes I think, especially in today's society, that everybody's super busy, and so it's like go 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 all the time, and you don't really have those moments to like just sort of pause unless something bad has happened. Then you obviously you want to sort of check in with your child. But I think having this ongoing relationship of communication then helps to set the stage where your child now feels really comfortable talking with you about all types of things, even some of those difficult issues, because they know that you can be there to listen and to support them. And sometimes when you don't have that relationship, kids are not sure, like, hey, is it okay for me to sort of go to mom or dad about this, or to talk with, my parents about something that I may be struggling with, because they don't know that that space is there. And obviously, for most parents, like they are very supportive, even though they may not sort of show up and like communicate, like, hey, if something is going on, it's always okay for you to sort of come to me. So I think that's a really important piece that I want to sort of emphasize in the book.
Yeah, it's like a practice. You're having that ongoing communication so that when those things do come up, they feel comfortable. And even if you always are open and say, like, I'm here for you, but if you're practicing it daily in just normal communication, I can see how that would be really helpful for the child when they do have something come up.
Yeah.
Along with all that communication, obviously racism has always been a huge issue, but it's so much at the fingertips of our young people these days with social media, with the internet. What are some ways that you recommend parents and caregivers can minimize sort of that indirect exposure where they're just sort of witnessing it as they're scrolling or you're turning on the TV or whatever it may be?
Yeah. And I'm really glad you asked that question, because I do think about that in today's society, the ways that children and even adults witness and experience racism is very different than maybe how we've experienced it, 20, 30, 40 years ago, because of social media. And I think, as we've seen from the research, really understanding that it doesn't always have to be sort of this direct experience that can lead to this negative impact, and that when you have indirect exposure through witnessing others or even just hearing about other stories, that it can have an impact on you emotionally. So I think in the sort of face of living in a society that is very connected through technology and social media, that it really is important for parents to sort of recognize how to reduce exposure to some of those things. And so one of the things I think I was mindful of a couple of years ago, I have nieces and nephews, and I remember one really young, early childhood, and had a tablet. And most kids, I think today, have tablets where parents, give it to their child to engage in like educational content or just sort of watch things to sort of, pass the time. But I think the ways that technology and social media shows up in our lives today, that, if kids are watching even like an educational program on like YouTube, you don't know what's going to happen in the midst of like these ads now pop up all the time, especially on the free service. And so I think for parents to sort of do some check-ins to really know like what their child is engaging in on those applications, and to understand, what may or may not come through from the algorithm. So it may be important for you to like just type in YouTube, some video or thing that your kid often sort of watches, to see like, okay, if my child is watching this for an hour or 30 minutes, like what pops up, what comes up, after that clip ends, because all kinds of things show up on these platforms, and you just never know when like an ad that is showing a kid being bullied because of their racial identity, and so that could impact the child in some particular way. So I think that's one thing for parents to really have that awareness about, is if my child has a tablet or is watching, let's say educational content on something like YouTube, what types of things are they going to potentially be exposed to, and how can I minimize that? So checking your settings, or checking the child's settings on some of those platforms, where in many cases they do have a feature to like turn off sensitive content. And so that may be something that might be really important, especially if there are some restrictions around like kids having things like Instagram, for example. But let's say your child does have it and they're sort of outside of the age range, it might be important to make sure that sensitive content is turned on, so that way, if these videos, let's say about police violence, for example, are being shown even by like news media, that it's going to minimize that popping up on your child's feed, or popping up for you to see it, and your child is in the room in earshot, and could potentially peep over your shoulder to see like, hey, what are you watching? So I think those are some really important things to keep in mind to help reduce some of that indirect exposure.
When your child isn't communicating with you, or you talk about it being common for children to hide these hurtful experiences, what are some ways that one a parent can notice sort of those signs of racial stress if their child's not communicating? And also, how do they initiate a check-in if they're concerned about their child having gone through something and not able to talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I talk a lot about with parents in particular is that because of the child's development, they may not always like verbalize a lot of things to you, especially when something negative is going on with them emotionally, that oftentimes it does show up in some type of behavioral way. So looking to see, if your child is very like outgoing, now they isolated themselves, more, or they don't want to, play with other kids, or their friends, or go outside of the home, or be away from you for too long. Those may be some things that you want to watch out for in terms of like anxiety or worries. Do you see them checking in more often on you, or are they, afraid or nervous about going to school, when they used to be excited, about going to school to learn? And so maybe, checking in those types of instances. And I really think that when you do the check in, if you notice some of these sort of behavioral signs, that it doesn't have to be like a high pressured situation. Because I think sometimes parents can sort of jump into be like, so I noticed like you don't want to go to school. Like, what's going on? Did somebody pick on you? And kids may be like, no, nothing happened. And so I think, trying to approach it in a way that is really sort of low pressure, and really just tries to like explore and understand what's going on with the child. So I think really, for me, encouraging parents to even just like driving, in the car, that you can ask questions about, oh, how was things today for you? Or, is there anything fun that you learned at school today? So I think starting off easy can be really helpful. And then if you say like, hey, what went really well for you today? The flip side of that could be like, was anything that was hard or challenging for you? And then they may say, well, I saw this kid get picked on, because of XYZ. And if it's something related to their race or some type of discrimination, then you can sort of understand that a little bit more and then be able to help support your child through that.
Well, I like also that method because, like you said, you can start with something positive, like what went well for you. And I think that's just such a great way to approach a conversation, whatever the conversation may be. So I really like that tactic. Earlier, we were talking about sort of the parent, obviously, it being important for them to sort of examine their own relationship with racism and discrimination. But you also have a huge chunk of the book about self care and taking care of their mental health. And I think the term self care has just been turned into like taking a bubble bath or like doing something like that. But what are some ways on a deeper level that you recommend for parents to engage in that self care?
Yeah, no, this is really important to talk about because I do think, as you mentioned, that I think we've commercialized the idea of self care. So when we talk about it or use the term, I think the one that comes up most often for people is like physical or social self-care. So, taking the bubble bath or going to the spa or going to brunch, with your friends or something like that. And all of those things are important. But one of my colleagues, Dr. Robin Gobin, talked about these sort of 6 dimensions of self-care, which I thought are really useful for parents to think about. And I try to, integrate some of these in my own personal life. But these 6 dimensions of self care include physical self care, social self care, intellectual self care, vocational, spiritual, and emotional self care. And so all of those I talk about in the book and give some strategies for parents to use. And for me, when I think about those 6 dimensions, I often highlight for parents and some of my clients about trying to create your self-care plan where you can like identify what are these activities across those 6 dimensions that I maybe like to do most often or find most enjoyable or most relaxing for myself, and then try to integrate those things throughout your week because you can't go, I mean, well, for most of us, we can't go to the spa every week, right? So what are the things that you can do on sort of a pretty frequent basis that maybe don't require as sort of much financial means to be able to do to help you to manage yourself emotionally and physically, to help reduce stress when you may encounter it, and also if you experience some stress, to help you to decompress and relax. So one of the things that I often highlight as it relates to self-care is just like exercise. That's one of those physical activities, and sleep. So those are really sort of basic types of needs. But also, I think when we're stressed, oftentimes those are the things that tend to go first. And so, really reminding people to recognize that even those simple things like exercising for like 5 to 10 minutes can really be helpful as a stress sort of reduction strategy. So, engage in those types of activities. And then some of the other things that I think are also helpful for parents is recognizing the variety of other self-care strategies like, reading a book, which might be some intellectual self-care, or for those that are spiritual or religious, engaging with your spiritual religious community, or even just being outside in nature. There's a lot of health benefits to that as well. So really for parents to recognize that there's so many different ways that you can engage in self-care outside of just like, going to the spa or eating a fancy dinner.
Do you find that the parents and caregivers that you work with have like a reluctance to take care of themselves, and sort of how do you combat that, like the excuses that come up? Like obviously a lot of parents are very focused only on their child. So I imagine you maybe see some reluctance to this, and what do you say to them to sort of talk about why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. I see reluctance. And as I mentioned before, I think part of it is that, as a parent and as an adult, like life is really busy. And so it can be hard to sometimes just slow down. But I think as a parent, one of the things that I often hear is also that time is an issue. So I don't have time to do self care because I am, have work, and then I get home from work and I have kids and the things that they have to sort of, get done, and what I have to do to support them physically and emotionally. And so I really like to remind people that when we think about self care, that it doesn't have to be something that you do for a really long time. There's so much research that talks about even as little as 3 minutes of like a mindful breathing exercise can really be helpful to self regulating, and helps to sort of boost your mood. So, really reminded parents that I understand that things are really busy, but you don't have to create a lot of time. It's great if you can take 30 minutes to like read a book and, take a bubble bath for yourself, but sometimes everyone doesn't have that luxury. And so really thinking about what can I do within like a 5 to 10 minute time frame that's also helpful for me. It gives me a break. It gives me an opportunity to sort of decompress, and then I can integrate this into my week. So that's one of the things that I oftentimes do, sort of have parents struggle with about making that time for themselves.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew McKay, creator of Therapy Assist. We've designed Therapy Assist to be an accessible and efficient platform. By providing a library of thousands of resources and the ability to customize workbooks, we're putting evidence-based tools in your hand, helping to improve client outcomes. Research consistently shows that between session homework can significantly improve client outcomes and reduce dropout. But finding the right tools to assign can be time-consuming. Therapy Assist makes this process faster and easier. You can search through a library of curated resources, including psychoeducation, worksheets, exercises, meditations, and much more. You can use these resources both during your sessions and as homework assignments for clients, all with the confidence that they are rooted in evidence-based therapies. Therapy Assist's resource library is built on the firm foundation of New Harbinger Publications' 50-plus years of pioneering work in self-help and psychology. So you'll have resources created by world-renowned psychologists and researchers right at your fingertips. Our platform makes it easy for you to find exactly what you need with search filters and curated protocols. These comprehensive tools provide you with the ability to search for a resource by any combination of therapy type, presenting problem, transdiagnostic mechanism, intervention, or resource type. Therapy Assist helps you support more clients between sessions in less time. I know therapists often spend hours searching through files, books, or online to find the resources they need. Therapy Assist takes care of this for you, saving you valuable time you can use to focus on what matters most, helping your clients heal and thrive. With Therapy Assist, you can also review completed resources ahead of time, which means you'll be fully prepared for each session, ready to make the most of your time with your client. We understand the importance of having access to the most effective client resources in your work, and we're committed to continuously updating our library to keep pace with the latest research and cutting-edge tools in the field. Your clients' privacy and security are top priorities for us. Therapy Assist is fully HIPAA compliant, so you can trust that the data entered is kept safe and confidential. To start your free trial and find out how Therapy Assist can transform your practice, go to therapyassist.com. We're here to support you every step of the way.
You talk about the importance of modeling healthy coping strategies for parents. What does that look like in practice? And maybe, I guess, how can you include your child in it? Because I think that can kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, no, I think, modeling is really important. And again, for me as a psychologist, oftentimes when I talk with parents about helping their child sort of cope with, let's say, anxiety, it is like if you're an anxious person and your child sees this, they're probably going to pick up on some of those things indirectly, even though you're not communicating to them verbally, like, this is what's going on with my body. And while I'm doing certain things a certain way, they may also begin to do those things as well. So we know that sort of from like a social learning perspective, that kids often learn through observation and what they observe, in their environment. So for parents to really take that as a sort of a nugget to recognize that the ways that you cope with stress in your own life is also going to shape your child. So I oftentimes work with parents about how do you, one, use healthy coping strategies, and then how do you verbalize or talk through those coping strategies so that your child sees and hears you doing that. But also, as you mentioned, the importance of like doing things with your child. You can also then say, hey, you want to try this with me, and sort of bring them in to that activity as well. So I think in terms of like, let's say you have a really stressful day and you get home and like things are also maybe not going as great as you would like them to be. So your stress is still elevated. It might be helpful to like verbalize and talk through that to be like, hey, I had a really long day. I'm really stressed out. I don't feel like doing anything, but I'm going to take a couple moments, take a couple deep breaths, and everything's going to be okay. So just in that moment, it can sort of model for your child that, hey, it's okay to be stressed out sometimes. This is what you can do to cope with that stress by taking like a couple of deep breaths, and also being able to say like using some type of affirmation for myself can also be helpful when I'm going through those moments. And again, I think doing those with your child sometimes can also be a really important strategy to help them cope. And that's something that I highlighted in the book about how to like do these things with your child as a way to help foster that coping and resilience.
Yeah, that's so important. And stepping back a little bit, you talked about the different modalities you use in this book. And I want to ask more about how you feel cognitive behavioral therapy works with coping with racial stress, and also what strategies of CBT do you find most helpful?
There's obviously a lot of research looking at cognitive behavior therapy and CBT and how it can be helpful. And one of the things that I do talk about in the book is that when we think about racial stress and like the symptoms like anxiety, worries, sadness, anger, there's decades of research that really talks about how CBT can help even with those particular symptoms that are highlighted. And so I think just for parents to recognize, like, yes, there's a lot of science that we know around how CBT is helpful for addressing psychological symptoms and symptoms of racial stress. And these are some things that you can do. So for me, I think one of the really important pieces that I highlight in the book as it relates to CBT is just one for parents to recognize what are those like relationships between their thoughts, their emotions, and then sort of what they behave. And obviously, this sort of connects with children as well. So I think, like from a like informational psychoeducation perspective, that for a lot of adults and for parents, that's something that they maybe didn't have that sort of awareness about. They may have sort of had those experiences, but just sort of having the information about, I think the science may have been new for some people. And so strategies that I think are most helpful from CBT in particular goes back to like one of the examples that I talked about earlier with like using cognitive reframing. So, how can you think differently about situations? And so, having this sort of balanced view. And for me, when we talk about cognitive reframing, I think we also want to avoid like this being overly positive. Like I recognize like we live in a society where we there's this hyper focus on positivity, and that's great. But I think it's also important to recognize like yes, there are going to be moments where that maybe isn't as useful for you, especially if you're in a situation where like you're constantly being bombarded by situations that are negative, or you can't sort of get out of those situations. Using positive reinforcement and positive reframing might be helpful a little bit, but if you're stuck in that situation, just imagine like trying to think positive, but you have this negativity around you all the time. And so I think other strategies that might be helpful include things like behavior activation. So really thinking about the body and movement and exercise, and what are those benefits psychologically can also be helpful. So I think that's another strategy. And then relaxation and breathing techniques. And there are a couple of exercises that I mentioned in the book that can be helpful for parents, and also for parents to teach their children to help them cope with racial stress.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this earlier about particularly the breathing exercises. When I'm trying to practice mindfulness activities, breathing is a big trigger for me. Focusing on my breath is triggering. Like, can I breathe? Like I get sort of those thoughts, and I have to wonder or feel like I'm not alone in that being something that is hard for me to manage. Do you have recommendations that aren't breathing strategies for sort of engaging in that mindfulness?
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that because I actually went to a conference a couple of months back that talked about mindfulness and particularly touched on like the breathing piece and like for some people when they're using some mindfulness activities, they don't necessarily feel the benefits that most people might feel from those. And so I think it is important for parents to recognize for themselves and obviously for their child if there is a particular exercise or activity that they are considering that maybe the child doesn't feel like it's helping at all, then it's okay to like find something else to be able to do. And so I think, one of the other things that I talk about in the book and sort of highlighted earlier was this idea about like movement and exercise. And obviously like there are different types of exercise, right? But I think for kids, it's important to consider that like exercise and movement doesn't always have to be like, I don't know, push-ups, jumping jacks, running or whatever. That dance can be a form of exercise. So maybe kids just like to do that. And maybe it's not anything like fancy dancing. It's just like for them doing some silly movements. Like those types of things can actually be helpful and like get tension out of the body. So I think just sort of thinking about those types of strategies in terms of like, CBT or even just other like behavioral coping things, you want to consider that it doesn't always have to be like the breathing or the relaxation.
Yeah, thank you. I was literally just having this conversation this morning, so I'm glad I got to ask you that. Another really important topic that you broach in the book is the concept of racial socialization. Can you talk about what that is and how that can help with coping and promoting resilience?
Yeah, so I think we've been having a lot of conversations about racial socialization over the last couple of years in particular. And so one of the, I guess, most common ways that we think about racial socialization in Black families is having the race talk or talking with kids about racism or preparing them to experience some type of bias or discrimination. And so that's part of racial socialization is that preparation to experience bias or racism. But the other pieces of racial socialization that are also really important for parents to think about is this idea about how do kids learn about their culture and their identity. So racial socialization also focuses on communicating cultural knowledge, communicating cultural practices, and also history. So, Black history, I think, in particular, about how do we talk with kids about the positive contributions that many Black Americans have made to this country that help them on a day to day basis. And so, all of those aspects of racial socialization are really important and not just focusing in on the preparation for bias because one of the things that we do see is that yes that is useful for children, but if you only focus in on the preparation for bias it actually can have some negative drawbacks to it. And so I think it's important for parents to also think about these other positive aspects of racial socialization, which include, talking about the history or the cultural messages about the child's identity, because those play a significant role in buffering against some of the negative effects of racial discrimination. So what we see in terms of the research in the literature is that when kids have experiences of racial socialization, that it actually has a lot of positive benefits in terms of resilience and helping them recover, especially from experiences of racial discrimination. So let's imagine that your child is in a classroom where the teacher has like ignored them, because of their race or has made statements about, you're never gonna do good in this class or pass this test, but the child has been exposed to positive aspects of their culture and their history to say like I know, Black physicists or Black, scientists or medical doctors, the person who helped with like the corona vaccine for example. that those messages can be really powerful for kids to say, well, my teacher said I can't pass this test, but I know that there have been Black people who have made all of these excellent contributions to society, and that's going to help them to sort of confront some of those negative messages that they may receive from society about their identity and who they are.
Yeah, I have to imagine that also builds a pride and a confidence in themselves too. So it's like filling the well so that they have all of that for when something they do experience a microaggression or blatant racism, that they have that well to pull from of positivity about their culture and who where they come from.
Absolutely.
On the topic of that, I want to talk about activism and how parents can use that as a teaching moment and what might that look like. Also, you had a lot of conversation in your book about when the timing of that, like when should these conversations start? Can you talk about sort of all of that and activism as a means of teaching?
I'll start with the timing piece first. So I definitely understand and recognize that knowing when to talk with your kids about activism or types of activism or even engaging in that work with them can be challenging for parents. And I encourage parents to really lean on their own understanding of their child. Like, you know what things your child can handle and what they can understand. So I think if you have a child who you feel like they won't get when you talk with them about why you're going to protest, then it's probably not the time to like talk with them, about that and sort of what are the benefits of engaging in protest, for example. So I would say using your understanding of your child as sort of a gauge to determine when to have that conversation about activism or to do different types of activism activities. And so I think for me, as I talk about in the book, when parents consider activism and engaging in activism, one, recognizing that there are different types of activism. And so one of the things that I've talked about is this idea about like low risk versus high risk activism. So low risk might be that I work with my child to write a letter, to the school or to write a letter to their congresswoman or congressperson about a particular issue as it relates to discrimination or injustice in their community. So that would be low risk. So being able to talk about an issue and to advocate for change, but not sort of being on the front lines, for example. High risk might be something like attending a protest. The reason why that is high risk is because that activism activity might also have additional exposures to threat or violence. So let's say in some instances we see where protests escalate and like the police are involved or gas masks are needed and those types of things. Like that is a very high risk activity that might actually add more stress for both you and your child in that moment. So one, just recognizing for, when you make a decision about wanting to do activism, it's first thinking about, do I want to do a low risk versus a high risk activity? And if you're doing a high risk activity, I also encourage parents to like think about what is your plan in that moment, if in case something does escalate, like how do I get out of this situation to reduce exposure or some additional harm to me and my child is really important. And then the other piece of like activism as being like a teaching moment is that it does allow parents to then teach their child about the significance of why you're doing this work, but also how it has helped, in the past to change the ways that we live in this world, and also potentially talking about some of the cultural significance to some of those things. So one of the things that we've seen over maybe a couple of years ago, and this obviously isn't the first time that this has happened, but when we see kids who have are not allowed to wear natural hair, for example, and so we've seen like valedictorians in high schools that weren't allowed to like give their speech because they had natural hair. And so being able to talk with kids about like, what can you do to help to potentially change this policy so that people are allowed to wear their hair how they want, but then also connecting that back to the cultural significance of hair, especially for Black people, and thinking about like braiding styles. And I'm definitely not an expert on hair, but recognizing that there's a lot of history around how Black people, particularly in different countries in Africa, like braid their hair and like what that means to their culture and their identity and what sense of pride that brings in terms of like self-expression. So those can be some other ways that you can engage teaching moments with activism types of activities as well.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about too is along the lines of maybe going to a protest or engaging in sort of that activity. It does also build community. And I wanted to talk about the importance of that and what role community support plays in helping Black children build their resilience.
There's been a lot of conversations more recently about this idea about community care. And so I like that one because it just sort of builds on some of the historical things, especially within the Black community, about how important community has been, and this idea about having a village and the people that support you and that you support them. And so community care and the sense of community fosters this connection with others. It creates opportunities to engage in social support, which we know is really important in terms of a lot of aspects of resilience and helping us with our sort of mental health and well-being. And I think also for parents, having this community care also creates that space where you can talk about some of these issues related to racial discrimination, for example, that maybe they have also experienced. So being able to navigate together how you've felt with these experiences, how it has impacted you and your child emotionally, but also what are some things that you can sort of do to not only cope with this, but also thinking about like activism, for example. So, how can you work together with your community to create these moments where you can resist some of the difficulties that you may be experiencing within your own neighborhoods?
Yeah, and just like you said, like knowing that you aren't experiencing this alone can have a huge impact for the positive.
Absolutely.
Dr. Earl, that feels like a really good place to wrap up unless you have any final thoughts for our listeners.
No, I think that is great. The one thing that I guess I will say as we wrap up is recognizing that when you're engaging in some of these coping strategies with your child is that it does take practice. And I think as a parent, sometimes when you hear about, hey, this worked for my child and you try it out and then it doesn't work for your child, that it can be sort of scary or disheartening. And so, just as a reminder for parents that when you begin to use some of these strategies and techniques with your child, one, just sort of thinking about like learning what works for your child and what doesn't work. As you mentioned, like the breathing, maybe the breathing doesn't work for your child. You need to figure out something else. And then once you find something that does work, we know that, the more that you practice, it helps to strengthen and make it easier for your child to like use those skills in the moment. And so that repetition is also really important. And so just want to remind parents to think about like the one time is probably not going to be sufficient to help them and really sort of keep going with those strategies to help with the overall healing and resilience.
Yeah, that's important. Thank you so much, Dr. Earl, for your work and for this conversation. I'm sure a lot of parents are going to get the support they need from reading your book and working through the activities and, helping their child build resilience. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
A powerful step by step guide to help your child foster strength and resilience when faced with racial stress. Has your child experienced racial aggression, bullying, or harassment? Have they been discriminated against in the classroom and in extracurricular activities or amongst peers? Have they ever asked you why they are treated differently? If so, you are not alone. Discrimination and racism in society are a constant stressor and painful topic of conversation for many Black families. As a parent, you may want to protect your child from these injustices, but the truth is that the best way to protect them is by giving them the tools needed to build resilience and by instilling unshakable pride in who they are. In this much needed resource for parents of Black children, race and mental health expert Erlanger Turner combines evidence based cognitive behavioral therapy skills with mindfulness and liberation psychology to help your kids cope with race based stress, challenge systemic oppression and marginalization, and thrive. Using the author's innovative HEAL method, healing emotions and anxiety through liberation, you can help your kids better understand what causes racial stress and how to navigate it, take charge of their emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, feel empowered and prepared to cope with in the moment racism, build resilience, soulfulness, and joy, cultivate racial literacy, and become advocates for change. Although some children may not experience racism or discrimination directly, their emotional health and wellness may still be negatively impacted. Using the HEAL approach in this workbook, you'll know what to say to your child who has experienced or witnessed racism, when to say it, and how to help them heal and flourish. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code PODCAST25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. The best continuing education training does more than just fulfill requirements. It opens your mind to new possibilities, increases your confidence, and gives you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training partners with world-class experts to create cutting-edge, evidence-based courses for mental and behavioral health professionals. Learn how to heal trauma with Robin Walzer, explore values with Kelly Wilson, and master the basics of acceptance and commitment therapy with Matt Boone through an on-demand course. Or join experts and like-minded professionals live to take your practice to a new level. Find your next training opportunity at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.